Welcome, I'm Jocelyn Ajami and you're watching The Arabic Hour. On today's program we bring you Dr. Hugh Roberts on Salafist and Islamist movements in the Middle East and Africa.
Because of the problem with Iran, the West has been inclined in a sense to give a complete green light to the Gulf monarchies and their backing of Salafism.
Dr. Elaine Hagopian interviews Dr. Hugh Roberts on Salafist and Islamist movements in the Middle East and Africa, covering significant issues like the insurgencies in northern Mali, their impact on Algeria and Mauritania, as well as growth of Salafist influence and appeal in post-Arab Spring countries like Egypt and Tunisia. Dr. Hugh Roberts is the Edward Keller Professor of North African and Middle Eastern History at Tufts University. He holds a Ph.D. from Oxford University in history. He has taught at numerous prestigious institutions and was a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. He has lived and worked in Egypt and Algeria, conducting research on Algeria, Egyptian political history, and the history of Islamism in North Africa. He also worked for the International Crisis Group as director of its North Africa project. And now to our interview with Dr. Hugh Roberts.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and we are happy to welcome Hugh Roberts to Arabic Hour. He is with us today to speak about North Africa. Dr. Roberts, perhaps you can start off by telling us something about the reemergence of the Salafis in North Africa. As you know, most people concentrate today on the Arab world in terms of Syria or Gaza or what's going on in the Levant. But in fact, there's a lot going on in North Africa, and it's where the bulk of the Arab people actually live. So if you would just talk a little bit about before and after the Arab Spring, the Salafi movement within North Africa, and how it has impacted the region and particular countries.
Well, first of all, we talk about a resurgence of the Salafiyya, essentially because they have surprised us in both Egypt and to some extent Tunisia, and are now beginning to surprise us or concern us in Libya as well, in the wake of the revolutions that have occurred there. We've seen the Salafis in Egypt emerge as a political party, which is a striking development. We've seen them also emerge as an important force in Tunisia. We've seen them engaging in very dogmatic doctrinaire activity in Libya, destroying Sufi shrines and so on. And of course, a jihadi wing of the Salafiyya movement has been active all these years.
Explain the word jihadi
yes,
for our
the point is that Salafis are often identified with the militant, violent activists whom we generically call jihadis. That's to say those engaged in jihad, that's to say armed struggle of one kind or another. But in fact most Salafis are not jihadis. The mainstream of the Salafiyya movement is a non-violent form of Islamic activism. They're militant but not violent. They're not engaged in terrorism or other forms of violence. But we have this violent wing that is normally distinguished by the term jihadi Salafis as opposed to the rest.
Yes.
Now, just to stay with the mainstream for a moment, the Salafi movement has actually been present in North Africa for a long time, and it never went away. It's just that the dramatic emergence of a Salafi political party in Egypt and also the role they're playing in post-revolution Tunisia has seemed like a resurgence. To some extent you could say that they have gained in strength in those two countries in a way that is striking, but they've always been there in the other countries, particularly Algeria and Morocco, and for quite a while now down in the Central Sahara, in the Sahel belt, southern Algeria, northern Mali, and so on. First, to understand what the term Salafi means, Salafism is today a really quite aggressively fundamentalist current within Islamic activism in general.
And they're different from the Muslim Brothers.
And they're different from the Muslim Brothers, and that is there's an irony of history in the distinction between the two, because the original Salafiyya movement goes back to the 19th century, and it wasn't really fundamentalist. And what happened was that the Salafiyya movement, over time, veered in the direction of a fundamentalist and very dogmatic interpretation of Islam, as it came under the influence of Saudi Arabia. And so today, and for the last few decades, the real resurgence of Salafism really dates from the end of the 70s and early 80s.
Yes.
And with the Gulf monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia, promoting it. And promoting something that is really very almost totally influenced by the Wahhabi Islam of Saudi Arabia,
which is very severe.
It's very fundamentalist. The key point about it is its belief in, to use the term fundamentalist strictly, the literal inerrancy of Scripture. That's to say, it is a kind of cult of the Quran, of Scripture, and tends to a literal reading. In other words, it allows very little scope for interpretation. Whereas other tendencies within Islam allow quite a lot of room for interpretation, and therefore they are less dogmatic, they're less fundamentalist. Now, the irony I was referring to is that the Muslim Brothers, which were founded in Egypt in 1928, came out of, if you like, an earlier phase of the Salafiyya movement, before it became really fundamentalist. And what has emerged is quite a strong antagonism between the tradition of the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis. And one of the things that was at issue, it's worth just taking the trouble to grasp what has been at issue between these two points of view. The Muslim Brothers, as they've developed, have always been concerned with the, if you like, the overall character of society and the question of government of society. They've had, in other words, a program addressing the collectivity of Muslims in each particular country, with, of course, a reference to the overall global community, the Ummah in general. But they've been concerned with, if you like, common problems. That they've had a Muslim and Islamic answer to those problems, and of course their famous slogan is Islam is the solution.
Is the solution, right?
The Salafis, since the real resurgence began under Saudi and more general Gulf Arab patronage at the end of the 70s and in the 80s, partly inspired by fear of Iran, partly to do with the rivalry with revolutionary Shiism on the other side of the Gulf, has tended until recently to be very focused on the question of morals, on the question of how to be a good Muslim, what defines a good Muslim, what is correct Muslim behavior, what is incorrect Muslim behavior. And it hasn't really addressed the if you like, the problems and dilemmas of the collectivity so much. Its focus has tended to be the individual. Its great preoccupation is what is licit, halal, and what is illicit, haram. And as such, it has met a need, above all, for Muslims who are moving around. It's a kind of a view of Islam that enables individual Muslims to, in a sense, stay on the right path in terms of their religious belief and the morality derived from that. But Salafis have generally refused to participate in party politics. Their attitude to party politics is this is, in a sense, un-Islamic. They have been very hostile to the Muslim Brothers precisely because the Muslim Brothers have operated as parties, whether legal or not. And
especially in Egypt.
In Egypt, of course, they were illegal right up until the fall of Mubarak, and they've now become legal, and that is an important change in Egyptian political history. In other countries, they've been legal for quite a while, in Jordan, in Algeria, and so on. But they've been constantly the target of Salafi criticism on a rather dogmatic and traditionalist basis that political parties divide the community of believers. There's a critique of party politics in general because this divides the believers. It's what they would call fitna, the division of the community. And so it's now very remarkable that Salafis are themselves organizing themselves as political parties. They are, in one sense, putting that element of their doctrine to one side.
Well, let me just interrupt for a moment and ask you to see if there's a connection between the Saudi-Qatari support now that is happening for the Salafis. Seymour Hersh in 2007 wrote an article for the New Yorker called The Redirection. It's under the Bush administration. And as you know, he's a great investigative journalist. And he said that the Bush administration was making a turn on terms of policy. They weren't doing well in Iraq. They were concerned about Iran. They were concerned about Syria. And everything they tried up until that point hadn't quite worked to make this alliance of Hezbollah and Iran and Syria fall. And so he talked about the fact that the U.S. has gone along with the idea that Saudi Arabia and Qatar will underwrite even some of what are considered the greatest enemies in American government terms, underwrite the more jihadist form of to try to somehow counter the Shiism. As a result, of course, we see Qatar and Saudi Arabia involved in Egypt and in Libya and in Tunisia, perhaps in Algeria as well. And so it's spread. And my question to you is, has that policy adopted by the Bush administration, which Obama basically thought he could deal with these issues in terms of diplomacy, his Cairo speech of 2009, found he couldn't, and this policy was in process, and we know it's still going on in places like Syria and whatnot. Has this sort of allowed the Salafis to come out more in public and organize politically, or has this just been coincidental?
I'm not inclined to think it's coincidental. I think that, I assume that the American government is well aware of the constant role of Saudi backers for
they've encouraged
the Salafia movement. And so there's at the very least an irony in U.S., in a sense, tacit endorsement of this state of affairs, and of course it requires explanation. I think that it's not the sole factor behind it, of course. I think part of it is very much connected with the antagonism between the U.S. and, of course, not only the U.S., the U.K. and France as well, with Iran. The Iran question is, and the inability or the difficulty to resolve that in some sort of compromise.
Even to break the alliance between Syria and Iran. And I mean, they always thought that if they could get one down, it would be a domino effect. But Iran is the main target, you're right.
The point is that here, because of the problem with Iran, the West has been inclined, in a sense, to give a complete green light to the Gulf monarchies and their backing of Salafism. Even though that every now and then turns against Western interests.
Yes.
And this is where perhaps one should come back to the question of jihadi Salafism and link that in. As I said earlier, the mainstream Salafi movement sees itself as a missionary movement, as essentially a movement of preaching and religious conversion, or bringing Muslims back to the true path, above all in the sphere of morality. And that's often referred to as the Salafiyya ilmiya, that's to say the Salafiyya of the scientific, or the Salafiyya of learning, and the key actors are the scholars, the religious authorities, the possessors of erudition and so on, knowledge of scripture. But the Salafi version of Islam has always accepted jihad as having a legitimate place within Islam, and therefore there are situations where Salafis are quite able to take up arms. And we have, as a result, we have this jihadi wing, which of course dates back primarily in recent times it dates back to the Afghanistan, the war against the Soviet-backed regime in Kabul.
Which we encouraged.
Which the West very, very vigorously encouraged and then walked away from in a rather reckless fashion. And there's been a lot of bite back ever since, as we know, and that's what Al-Qaeda comes out of in particular. And the point is that with the proliferation of areas of conflict in the Muslim world, the Balkans, for instance, in the 90s, and of course Palestine as a kind of constant area of conflict, and one could enumerate numerous others, there's always been, if you like, terrain on which Salafis can easily become jihadis. There are battles from their point of view. There are battles to fight, and it seems to me quite clear that the West really doesn't have any general answer to this issue.
And the funny thing is, of course, that the West doesn't want them in government, but it has encouraged them. In the same way that Israel had encouraged Hamas, for example, in the first Intifada to checkmate the secular PLO.
Mm-hmm.
So that's true. Tell us how particularly the Salafi jihadist movement has expressed itself in places like Libya, Tunisia, Algeria. Especially Algeria, which is, of course, a very big country and most important, and has a very large Berber group in the Kabyle and elsewhere, but in the Kabyle especially, that's very unhappy with their situation in Algeria. So how has this jihadi Salafi movement affected these countries?
Well, we really ought to begin with Algeria because when the Algerian authorities first of all legalized an Islamist political party known as the Islamic Salvation Front in 1989, and then it allowed it to win elections. And then when it won the second election, or won the first round of the second election, they then closed it all down. This precipitated a descent into violence.
1992.
That was 1992. The point is that there were other currents in Algerian Islamism that never believed that the election route would be allowed to follow its logic, and so they were in a sense prepared to take up arms when they were proved right, which was in January 1992. And quite a lot of those were of a Salafi jihadi outlook. Quite a lot of them had in fact fought in Afghanistan and had picked up the fashions of the fighters from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from Egypt.
In fact, they were called Afghani.
In Algeria, they were known as the Afghans. They were Algerians who'd come back
Yes.
from Afghanistan. And they formed the nucleus of what turned out to be the most ferociously murderous grouping, known as the Armed Islamic Group, the GIA by its French acronym. And they were at the core of the terrible violence of the 1990s. Now, what's happened is that that's, of course, come to an end, except that there's this spin-off from the GIA that we now call Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, but originally called itself, it was a section of the GIA that broke away from the main body in 1998 over precisely because it disagreed with the strategy of indiscriminate killing and massacres and so on. It was revolted by that and regarded that as a deviation. And they initially called themselves the Salafi Group for Preaching and Combat, the GSPC.
Yeah, then they changed their name.
And then, after 7 or 8 years, they rebranded themselves as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And they are the outfit that they still exist in the north of Algeria, but are mainly confined to the Kabylia region, as you mentioned, which is the main Berber region in Algeria, and quite close to the capital. It's just an hour's drive from Algiers, up in the mountains. But their other zone of activity since 2003 has been down in the far south, in the border territory on the Algerian-Mali-Niger borderland, and of course particularly in northern Mali, where there is now a crisis in which they are an actor.
Yeah, which we want to discuss.
Sure.
But if you also would just comment on Libya and Tunisia in general.
Well,
and then let us turn to Mali, because this is very important. Algeria is very important.
Sure. Now, In Libya, of course, under Gaddafi, no Islamic movements were allowed. He sought to maintain a complete monopoly of all forms of activism. But there was this quite violent jihadi group, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was Salafi, which was jihadi Salafi in outlook, and they waged a campaign of terrorism against the Gaddafi regime, against the so-called Jamahiriya in the 1990s. And which they lost. The state proved strong enough to crush them after a while, and of course rough methods were used on both sides. And, but then in the years leading up to the events of 2011, there was an attempt by the Gaddafi regime to negotiate a kind of a compromise or a settlement with the imprisoned members of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and they were released. There was an attempt to get them to, in a sense, recant.
And to join the Gaddafi forces.
Well, in some cases, but there was an attempt to, in a sense, to rehabilitate them by persuading them that they'd got things wrong, and that was, in a sense, imitating a process that occurred in Egypt with another violent group, the Gama, as it's known, where there had been a very interesting process of rethinking and rehabilitation combined with self-criticism. So there was an attempt to sort of overcome that historic and bitter division there. But it didn't really help Gaddafi and co at all, because, of course, veterans of this Islamic jihadi group were very prominent in the rebellion and provided, in fact, many of the most effective militias fighting the Gaddafi regime,
as part of the rebels,
and have been an important force ever since, as we are aware.
They apparently became the security forces for the Libyan government, and of course they were involved. Some say they were Tunisian jihadists as well, involved in the killing of our ambassador and the other Americans in Benghazi. So that they really did research there.
Sure.
And so if you go on, I'm sorry, with Tunisia, if you like.
Tunisia, to put it very schematically, is rather more like the Egyptian story. In both cases, if you like, the mainstream of political Islamism has been, in Egypt, of course, the original Muslim Brothers, what you could call the mothership, because, of course, there are parties derived from this tradition in many countries that are recognized as sister parties. In Tunisia, the equivalent is Ennahda.
Yes, Ennahda is really, as you say, it's like the Muslim Brothers.
It's like the Muslim Brothers. It's much closer to the Muslim Brothers than anything else. It's political Islamism. It's not that dogmatic in terms of, it's not that fundamentalist. It has.
And it's the governing party.
And it's now the party that...
And the president has promised to keep Tunisia basically, quote-unquote, secular, except for certain kinds of things.
And that's, of course, going to be an interesting question to watch, because and here there's the difference, in that, of course, the Muslim Brothers in Egypt have inherited a state, or have taken over, partly taken over, a state that has long undergone a process of creeping Islamization. It's been an article of the Constitution for many, many years that the Sharia are the principal source of law. And I lived in Egypt for quite a while and talked to the brothers and asked them if they had a critique of the Egyptian state as un-Islamic, and they said not at all. It is an Islamic state already. Now, that's not true of Tunisia, because, of course, the tradition of Tunisia since independence was this very westernized,
like Lebanon,
secular,
almost like Lebanon, but without some of the problems of Lebanon.
But also without the pluralism of Lebanon.
Yes.
It was a in effect, a one-party dictatorship. If anything, in that respect, a bit more like the Ba'athist countries. You had a strong party rule, committed to a modernist and secular vision.
And very Western.
And in Tunisia's case, particularly Western, to the extent that some Tunisians considered themselves to be virtually European. And now, so that makes it a particularly interesting case that you now have Islamists, the dominant force. What are they going to do with this legacy of this modernist secular state? And I'm sure that we'll see a process of trial and error and a good deal of conflict. But where it gets complicated, and this is where I bring in the Salafists, is that in both Tunisia and Egypt we've seen this emergence of a militant Salafism outside the mainstream, outside Ennahda in Tunisia, outside the Muslim Brothers, causing all kinds of headaches for them. And this is, in my view, a very negative development, and here's why. Let me take the Egyptian case for a moment. If the Salafis had not emerged as a major electoral contender, which they've done, I mean, in the elections,
they won 25% of the parliamentary
they
vote,
won an astonishing number of seats,
yes,
coming from nowhere.
Yes.
This means this puts the brothers under intense pressure on their Islamic flank, which inhibits them from reaching out on their non-Islamic flank. The pressure on them makes it harder for them to reach some sort of compromises and consensus positions with secular tendencies in Egyptian society. And that means it's harder for them to, if you like, secure general acceptance of their legitimacy and power, and harder for them to promote a sense of consent to the new arrangements that need to be devised and then maintained following the revolution against Mubarak and so on. And broadly speaking, the emergence of Salafism in Tunisia causes a comparable problem for Ennahda.
It's very similar. I mean,
in that respect.
It's on a different scale,
yeah,
but similar.
So in both cases, it means that the transition to the post-Mubarak Egypt, the transition to the post-one-party Tunisia, is complicated by this and made much more difficult. And that means that it aggravates the danger of identity issues and bitter secular versus religious points of view, that conflict that cost over 100,000 lives in Algeria, being reproduced at some point or another in both these other countries. There's grounds for real concern about this.
It's fascinating that President Morsi of Egypt and President Mazrouk of Tunisia have been trying to do this balancing act. The Tunisian president tends to be a little bit more secular sounding. Nonetheless, the fact that they survive and somehow go ahead, they're getting pressure on all sides. Do you think that they will, as heads of sort of Muslim Brotherhood type parties, or coming from those parties, that they can manage the Salafis and manage this Arab Spring, in quotes, in Tunisia and Egypt?
It's going to be very difficult for both of them. I'm not pessimistic, but I consider that they are facing considerable difficulties.
Writing a constitution in both of these cases.
In both cases, there is an acute problem of securing agreement to the new constitution. And we've just seen in Egypt the churches, the Christian elements have withdrawn from the body that is supposed to write the new constitution.
The Constituent Assembly, yes.
So already we're seeing in outline the danger of a sectarian conflict emerging or re-emerging. That means that the new Egypt, with its constitution, will not have general acceptance as providing a framework within which people can do political battle without leading to anything violent.
They have their situation cut out for them. I think President Morsi is really he's trying to deal with the liberals and he's trying to deal with the Salafis, and within his own party, though they basically support him. Nonetheless, as you said, the compromises are more difficult to make all around.
I think that Morsi and more generally the brothers would like to be able to get on dealing with some of the, if you like, the material, critical material problems facing Egyptian society, and the danger is that these sectarian or dogmatic, doctrinal rivalries are going to preoccupy them and hamper them from actually performing effectively in government.
You have been watching Professor Elaine Hagopian's interview with Dr. Hugh Roberts over the outgrowth of Islamism and Salafism in the Middle East and Africa in post-Arab Spring world. We'll be back with more after this short break. You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Let us turn back to Algeria and the situation on the border with Mali. And as we know, Algeria is the largest country. It has 36 million people. Mm-hmm. It's the second largest Arab, population. It's not all Arab, it's 30% Berber, to Egypt, which has 80 million plus. As you can go back in history, Farhat Abbas in 1936 said in Algeria, he looked around and he did not see an Algerian nation. And then suddenly there is this Algerian state. It may not yet be a nation, but tell us a little bit about the situation in Algeria itself, the Kabyles, and the really difficult situation on the Mali border, which is affecting Mauritania and West Africa and Algeria.
Well, Algeria, of course, went through this terrible ordeal during the 1990s. This terrible violence precipitated by the decision of the army essentially to stop the political process that had taken place, that had yielded this sensational result for the Islamist party. The country was torn apart by this, and for the last 12 years it's been recovering. The violence was pretty quickly reduced following the accession to the presidency of Abdelaziz Bouteflika in 1999. Already, the fact of the matter is that within the regime there was already a growing agreement, we must stop this, this is too much.
And they removed the state of emergency laws.
Well, that's very recent.
Yes.
They kept them in being right up until last year. That's a different issue. Can we perhaps come back to that in a minute? But there was an agreement, or growing agreement within the regime from the mid-90s onwards, that this is getting out of hand and we have to find a way to bring it down. And eventually Bouteflika was, if you like, a consensus candidate to do the honours. The violence largely ended in the north, except in the Kabylia region and a few other smaller places. But was, in a sense, migrated right down to the far south, and where a new story began there, and which we're now looking at. But up in the north, there is, of course, an unresolved issue of identity, but I think it's a mistake to... it's not as unresolved as all that. There is a strong sense amongst Algerians, including the Kabyles, that they are Algerians. And one of the reasons for, it may be surprising to our hearers to learn that President Bouteflika is actually still fairly popular. The idea of an Arab head of state who is popular may seem to have disappeared, but he is one of the reasons why there hasn't been a Tunisian or Egyptian scenario or a Libyan scenario in Algeria recently, is that in fact Algerians, they're not that angry with their president. He's only been president since 1999, which by the regional standards is really quite a short period of time. And he's given credit for having reduced the violence and he's been a bit lucky, but he's presided over a return of peace and a return of a degree of prosperity. The state finances are very healthy. So he's not loathed, but the point is that, what I was going to make is that when he was running for re-election for a second term in 2004 and also more recently in 2009, an important element of his platform was binding up the wounds, bringing the nation back together, and this went down very well. There was a yearning amongst Algerians for the divisions that had torn them apart to be overcome. And within that context, there's long been a recognition in Algeria of the Berber dimension. We shouldn't forget that the constitution now acknowledges this as one of the three pillars of the Algerian personality.
And I think it's important for our audience to understand that the Berbers are not originally Arabs.
Yes.
And there are different kinds of Berbers.
Correct.
But in Algeria, you have a really dense population of Berbers in the area that's called Kabylia in the north.
Exactly.
So,
Okay.
sorry.
The Kabyles are the largest of,
Yes,
of the various
of the
Berber
various-
populations.
yes.
We don't have precise statistics for how many there are, but my guess is that it's around 6 million Kabyles. And Kabylia, although mountainous, is actually the most densely settled area of North Africa outside the cities, other than the Nile Delta. There's a phenomenal population density. It's a region of extraordinary number of large villages.
Yes.
And it's depended for a very long time, therefore, on out-migration, on labor migration to other parts of Algeria, and since the First World War to France. And as a result, most Kabyles have command of the French language, which is not true of all Algerians. But it means that the region is reliant on income flows from outside. There's a high percentage of the population of the national capital, Algiers, are Kabyle, either second or third generation or whatever, and have links with their home villages in the hills. A significant number of the national political elite are Kabyles. We shouldn't assume that because they're a minority in ethnic terms,
Yes.
that they're oppressed or disadvantaged. In fact, many Algerians resent the Kabyles because they think that they are actually, in some sense, privileged, that they're overrepresented in key elements of the state, the intelligence services, many government ministries, and so on. They have a peculiar position because, on the one hand, as I say, they are not that disadvantaged as a category. On the other hand, the region today is in a very demoralized state. And that's partly because the state has withdrawn from its earlier ambitions in the economic sphere and no longer invests in there's very little public investment in Kabylia, whereas in the 60s and 70s there was a great deal. And so it's a very depressed region in economic terms, and this is a source of immense frustration for the younger generation, who are miserable and angry. And the other point is, of course, there's been a cultural movement, and a movement about the Berber identity.
Yes, their language.
The Kabyles were the pioneers of what we now see across North Africa, the so-called Amazigh movement, Amazigh being the Berber word for Berber, Thamazigh being the language, but Amazigh meaning the Berber as the identity. And so you have, on the one hand, this contestation of the state in the cultural sphere, and but on the other hand, at the same time, overrepresentation within the state in terms of access to power.
This is a kind of program by itself on the Kabyles. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left to discuss Mali and why it is important, and the growth of the fundamentalists on the border and how it affects Algeria.
Well, we've seen the migration to this area of elements of the jihadi movement from the north, the GSPC, from Algeria. And they have dug themselves in along that sort of no man's land, particularly northern Mali, where you have a large Tuareg population. You have
and the Tuaregs themselves are Berber.
The Tuareg themselves are Berbers. They're Berbers of the desert, of the deep Sahara. And there are Tuareg in southern Algeria, in northern Mali, in northern Niger, just next door to the east, and in southwestern Libya. So you have a whole zone of Tuareg population. And there has been, in Mali in particular, long-standing difficulty between the Tuareg in the north and the government based down in Bamako, which is in effect, the black African south of the country. There's an ethnic division. But, and you've had a Tuareg movement wanting, there have been rebellions in the past.
Their own state.
Some of them, they talk about their own homeland, which they call Azawad. But it's not clear that they're committed to independence. That's one option. There's some talk of autonomy as well, and one suspects that actually if they would only get a better deal from the Bamako authorities, a lot of them would be content with that. There's a sort of flux over precisely what they want. In this situation, you add in the Al-Qaeda element that is both inclined to fight all the various authorities around, but also particularly digging into the trans-Saharan smuggling rackets and things like cigarettes, like other goods for which there's a big market, but particularly drugs. Add in then the return from Libya following the defeat of Gaddafi of a very substantial number of people from Mali
with arms.
Libya is awash with arms, absolutely awash with arms. And the Tuareg from northern Mali, Gaddafi had long played a role in the Tuareg areas, and in fact a role facilitating compromises, on the whole a rather constructive one, while at the same time being a very staunch opponent of Al-Qaeda. And therefore the Gaddafi regime was part of the security, if you like, the network of powers maintaining security. That's gone. The returning Tuareg, embittered Tuareg to northern Mali, this swelled the northern resentments against the south. It swelled what initially was a Tuareg-oriented uprising, but which was then very quickly dispossessed by a rival movement that was a kind of Islamist movement, Ansar ad-Din. And you also have Al-Qaeda in the background. So we have at least 3 different political movements in northern Mali, a Tuareg sort of identity movement, and rival Islamist movements, both armed, all 3 armed. On top of which, other elements of the population, it's not just Tuareg. You have Arabs in northern Mali. You have another population, an African ethnic group called the Songhai, and so forth. So the situation is quite complex. And of course, the government in Bamako has been in chaos.
Yes, there was a coup.
There was a coup, and we've had this proposition of a military intervention backed by France and the states of West Africa, the ECOWAS countries. But it now looks as if France is having second thoughts about this. Algeria has been very opposed to a military intervention, arguing that this would basically break a lot of China.
And they're afraid they're going to have refugees.
And they would have to cope with the refugee problem that would be aggravated by this. And the point is that the idea of a military intervention, people have been talking about something like 4,000 or 5,000 troops. This would achieve nothing. We're talking about vast spaces.
But there was a meeting, and they've agreed to 3,300 from the West African nations and 5,000 from Mali. But the Algerians, Clinton, our Secretary of State Clinton, has gone and tried to bring them on board because they are important in that area. But at this point, we don't know what's going to happen. Even if they had a military action, it wouldn't come till later. But there is some attempt at diplomatics. But would you say that the spillover from this northern Mali area, which borders Algeria and Mauritania and so forth, that it could have very vast problems, reverberations throughout the area? And this is giving a great deal of concern to Africa, our own U.S. interests.
The point is that, as stated, the military intervention that is being envisaged it makes no sense at all.
It doesn't. No, it would be another Somalia.
Yes, but it could be. The point is it intended to be the thin end of a wedge? France doesn't propose to send her own forces. The idea is getting Africans to do it, but mainly West Africans who are unfamiliar with northern Mali, who wouldn't know their way around. Now, the point is that this is bound to fail. An intervention of this scale is bound to be a fiasco. So what is the second phase? Is this intended then to lay the basis for a much bigger intervention by NATO? In that case, there will be hell to pay. And this will, quite apart from anything else, greatly destabilize Algeria. Is that what Washington and Paris want?
I think they're very concerned about this.
Well,
the U.S. has been talking about drones and excuse me.
This is going to turn this place into a war zone.
Yes.
When in fact there's arguably no reason to do this. The fact is that Ansar ad-Din, the Islamic movement that took over most of the territory, has already announced that it wants a political solution and that it's prepared to lay down its arms and it's prepared to actually repeal its insistence on Islamic law. The MNLA has also been pleading for a political solution. And that leaves just Al-Qaeda, but the point is the 2 other main actors are both on board for a politically negotiated solution.
This would be a much better solution because the other would be a disaster.
Yes. Yes.
We'd like to, at some point to have you back. We've come to the end of our time and then some. And so we want to thank you. This was a very informative interview, and we are greatly appreciative. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You have watched Professor Elaine Hagopian's interview with Dr. Hugh Roberts over the outgrowth of Islamism in the Middle East and Africa in the post-Arab Spring world. Stay with us. We'll be back after this short break. You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
It's a poem in 9 parts, and it's called 50 Years On, Stones in an Unfinished Wall. 1. 50 years on, I am trying to tell the story of what was lost before my birth, the story of what was there. Before the stone house fell, mortar blasted loose, rocks carted away for new purposes or smashed, the land declared clean, empty. Before the oranges bowed in grief, blossoms sifting to the ground like snow, quickly melting. Before my father clamped his teeth hard on the pit of exile, slammed shut the door to his eyes. Before tears turned to disbelief, disbelief to anguish, anguish to helplessness, helplessness to rage, rage to despair. Before the cup was filled, raised forcibly to our lips. 50 years on, I am trying to tell the story of what we are still losing. 2. I am trying to find a home in history, but there is no more space in the books for exiles. The arbiters of justice have no time for the dispossessed without credentials. And what good are words when there is no page for the story? 3. The aftersong filters down like memory, echo of ash. History erased the names of 418 villages, emptied, razed. But cactus still rims the perimeters, emblem of what will not stay hidden. In the Yafa district alone, Al-Abbasiyya, Abu Kishik, Beit Dajan, Biyar Adas, Fajja, Al-Haram, Ijlil al-Kibliya, Ijlil al-Shamaliya, Al-Jamasina Gharbi, Al-Jamasina Sharki, Jarisha, Kafr Ana, Al-Khairiyya, Al-Masudiyya, Al-Mir, Al-Muwali, Ranitya, Al-Safariya, Salama, Sakiya, Al-Sawalima, Al-Sheikh Mawanis, Yazur, all that remains a scattering of stones and rubble across a forgotten landscape. 50 years on, the words push through, a splintered song forced out one note at a time. 4. The immensity of loss shrouds everything. In despair, we seek the particular, light angling gently in single rays. The houses of Deir Yassin were built of stone, strongly built with thick walls. A girls' school, a boys' school, a bakery, 2 guest houses, a social club, a thrift fund, 3 shops, 4 wells, 2 mosques. A village of stonecutters, a village of teachers and shopkeepers, an ordinary village with a peaceful reputation, until the massacre, carried out without discriminating among men and women, children and old people. In the aftermath, light remembers. Light searches out the hidden places, fills every crevice. Light peers through windows, slides across neatly swept doorsteps, finds the hiding places of the children. Light slips into every place where the villagers were killed, the houses, the streets, the doorways. Light traces the bloodstains. Light glints off the trucks that carried the men through the streets like sheep before butchering. Light pours into the wells where they threw the bodies. Light seeks out the places where sound was silenced. Light streams across stone. Light stops at the quarry. 5. Near Kisraya, circa 1938, a fisherman leans forward, flings his net across a sea slightly stirred by wind. To his left, land tumbles, rocky, blurred. To his right, sky is hemmed by an unclear horizon. 10 years before the Nakba, the future already closing down. 6. 50 years later, shock still hollows the throats of those driven out. Without water, we stumbled into the hills. A small child lay beside the road, sucking the breast of its dead mother. Outside Lidda, soldiers ordered everyone to throw all valuables onto a blanket. One young man refused. Almost casually, the soldier pulled up his rifle, shot the man. He fell, bleeding and dying. His bride screamed and cried. He fell to the earth. They fell in despair to the earth. The earth held them. The earth soaked up their cries. Their cries sank into the soil, filtered into underground streams. 50 springs on, their voices still rise from the earth, fierce as the poppies that cry from the hills each spring in remembrance. 7. Some stories are told in passing, barely heard in the larger anguish. Among those forced out was a mother with 2 babies, one named Yasmin, and another whose name no one remembers. Her life so short, even its echo is forgotten. The nameless child died on the march. It was a time of panic. No one could save a small girl. And so her face crumpled, lost beneath the weight of earth. I know only that she loved the moon, that lying ill on her mother's lap, she cried inconsolably, wanted to hold it in her hands. A child, she didn't know Palestine would soon shine, unreachable as the moon. 8. The river floods its banks, littering the troubled landscape. We pick our way amid shards, heir to a generation that broke their teeth on the bread of exile, that cracked their hearts on the stone of exile, necks bent beneath iron keys to absent doors. Their lamentations an unhealed wound. I was forced to leave my village, but the village refused to abandon me. My blood is there. My soul is flying in the sky over the old streets. 50 years on, soul still seeks a sky. 9. The walls were torn down long ago, homes demolished, rebuilding forbidden, but the stones remain. Someone dug them from the soil with bare hands, carried them across the fields. Someone set the stones in place on the terraced slope. Someone planted trees, dug wells. Someone still waits in the fields all night, humming the old songs quietly. Someone watches stars chip darkness into dawn. Someone remembers how stone holds dew through the summer night, how stone waits for the thirsty birds. The next poem is a poem that I wrote.
Thank you for joining us this week. If you're staying with us to the end of the hour, please enjoy our closing musical segment. From all of us here at the Arabic Hour, we hope you tune in next week, and we wish everyone a happy week. The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdalah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab-American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, AABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Beram Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
الساعة 7:07 دقايق أنا بعد من نومي شفايق وميت عشفت قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي ركوي تتقطع أطيب منها مش دايق مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق الساعة 7:07 دقايق أنا بعدي منها ومش فايق وميت عاشف قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي ركوي أطيب منها مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق ليالي و7 شهور مضيع حالي وعم بسأل عن حالي بقلبي بعيوني يلي بتحبك يا ويلي ما أطول دربك والأصعب كله مفارق الساعة 7:07 دقايق أنا بعدي منها ومش فايق وميت عاشف قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي ركوي أطيب منها مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق صوتك ينده لي والبوس بتشن علي وتلج العخدودك حارق الساعة 7:07 دقايق أنا بعدي منها ومش فايق وميت عاشف قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي ركوي وأطيب منها مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق لا 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 مش دايق لهجر قصرك وارجع بيت الشعر واعد لأهلي بعد ما دقت القمر